Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the Libertarian Angle on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Great to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I thought we would discuss something of really general concern, general interest, and that's the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's a document that we're all accustomed to. It's part of our daily conversations, our daily lives. We're taught about it from the first grade, if not before. But I suspect that sometimes people lose sight of what really that document, those documents are all about. So I thought, well, let's have a show where we discuss what the purposes are of the U.S. Constitution. Now, we know that the Constitution called into existence the federal government. The federal government, that is not like God, that's been here forever, through eternity. It actually came into existence by virtue of the fact that people called it into existence through the Constitution. The American people had been operating under the Articles of Confederation ever since the Revolution. Very weak government. The federal government under the Articles didn't even have the power to tax, and yet it went on for 13 years. So they go into the Constitutional Convention with the idea of they're going to modify the Articles of Confederation because there were problems arising. And they come out with this whole new idea. Hey, we're going to propose a new type of federal government, and we're asking you to approve this by adopting the Constitution. But here's an interesting question, Richard. Why didn't they just call the federal government into existence? Why did they have this document that limited the powers of the government? Because that's really what the Constitution did. It said, we're going to call the federal government into existence, but its powers are going to be very few and limited. And in fact, here are the enumerated powers. And even that wasn't good enough for the American people. They said, well, now wait a minute. We want something else in addition to this. We want a Bill of Rights, which really wasn't a list of rights. It was really a list of prohibitions. It prohibited the federal government from destroying freedom of speech and freedom of religion and detaining people without trial and violating people's right of due process of law. Well, my question, Richard, is why didn't they just call into existence a federal government and forget all the limitations, the restrictions, forget the Bill of Rights, forget the limitation on powers. Just have the government do the right thing. I mean, just trust government officials to enact laws that are in our interests, in the interests of the American people. I mean, after all, they are democratically elected. They're American citizens. They're people we put into office. Why not just let them do the right thing? In fact, here's the other question. Do we really need the Bill of Rights at all? I mean, isn't it sort of an insult to suggest that our federal officials, our troops, I mean, we praise the troops. Isn't it sort of an insult to say we need restrictions on you destroying freedom of speech and freedom of religion and rounding us up and inflicting cruel and unusual punishments on us? I mean, that's what the Bill of Rights and the Constitution really do. I think they insult federal officials by suggesting that in the absence of these express restrictions, they would be doing these things. So that's my secondary question is, why do we need these things? Why not just have a government that does the right thing and that we trust to do the right thing? What do you think?
Well, I think we have to remember the historical context of why the framers believed, as you're asking, the Constitution was necessary. Let's recall the types of regimes in general that were present in Europe. And North America was just an outgrowth of European colonial expansion. What were the kind of regimes predominantly in Europe before the American experiment? And that was monarchy. And the monarchs presumed, out of the rationale for their own rule, that there was a divine right of kings. God himself had appointed individuals or families to be temporal authorities to bring security, justice, order to the people within a geographical area. Now, the king, being God's representative on earth, had certain customs and traditions and boundaries, since he was still obligated to God for what he did, was viewed as having wide and extensive authority and power over his people, the use of the resources of the society, the imposition of laws and legislation. In other words, the king was absolute. The king abused people with unrestricted arrest at various times, unlimited and confiscatory taxation at various times, the censoring and the imprisoning of people for what they said or wrote, the restriction of religious freedom. The religion of the king was required to be the religion of the people under his power and authority. This arbitrariness, this absolutism, had led over many centuries, particularly in Britain, to the idea that the king needed to be restrained. It began in Great Britain's case, I know you are well conversant in this, Jacob, with Magna Carta, the writ of habeas corpus. The king cannot just arbitrarily arrest you and hold you indefinitely. Certain restraints on the ability of the king to tax without the consent of the governed. That began with the noblemen who insisted upon a parliament in Great Britain that would have the authority to approve the king's requests for revenues and through taxes. At that time, often, though not exclusively, to fund his wars. And in Britain, rather than having a formal document of a constitution, it was sort of like an evolved document of the customs of the law, restraining the king and what was required to be respected of, quote, the people. That began with the aristocrats, but then became generalized to more and more of everyone in Great Britain slowly over the centuries. Now, the founding fathers viewed themselves in the same way, Jacob, did they not? They had fought a war for independence against a king who they considered abusive in his regulatory taxing and repressing of freedom powers. They now asked the question. Now, the founding fathers were highly well read on the ancient classic literature of the Romans and the Greeks and all the experiences historically with different types of regimes. And they had been influenced by their contemporaries, and that was such as in France, Baron de Montesquieu, in his book *The Spirit of the Laws*, and they concluded that human beings have an invariant nature, and there's a good side to this nature, and there's a bad side to this nature. In other words, to use a more modern phrase from Star Wars, individuals can be tempted by the dark side of the Force. And that this dark side of the Force was power lusting, abuse of others for the acquisition of wealth, the forming of coalitions with groups to establish their unrestricted power over the lives and properties of the members of society, and that therefore you needed government, following John Locke's idea of a state of nature in which men are not secure from the abuses of their private fellows, to have an enforcement agency to secure people's life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. But they realized that government may be necessary, but it was a dangerous necessity. Because as the phrase goes, who guards you against the guardian? And therefore, they decided that there had to be a political structure that gave government the responsibilities and the authorities to perform these protection responsibilities, life, liberty, and property, but could not be used and abused and extended, that those with the power ended up abusing the very people whose rights they were meant to guard. So the idea was that you would limit the government to necessary and enumerated functions and responsibilities. And connected with that is that you had to make sure that power was not concentrated. And he wasn't the only one, but the model of Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws, that the way that you minimize this is you divide powers within government into different branches. And basically the idea of a judiciary branch, the courts, a legislative branch, the Congress, and a executive branch, the president, is basically a tripartite form of designing the government that Montesquieu lays out. He was their sort of template for designing that part of the Constitution. And then the dividing of responsibilities. What is the Senate liable to do? What is the House of Representatives liable to do? How are the representatives in the House elected versus how the representatives in the Senate are elected originally, before amendments changed that on the senatorial side early in the 20th century? What can the judiciary do? What are they responsible? To make laws, to usurp lawmaking power, or to interpret the law that Congress may pass and the president signs to make sure that it is in principle consistent with the stated enumerated responsibilities and duties of the federal government, but no further. And this was meant, therefore, to harness government. Now, why was this element? Well, the king is dead, metaphorically, right? You've done away with monarchy. So why are you concerned about the people ruling themselves? If the people elect the representatives, and the representatives therefore reflect what the people want, how can a person oppress himself? And collectively, how can the people oppress themselves? Well, they were very knowledgeable about the ancient and medieval experiences where democracy had been carried out. And they realized clearly that democracy could be abused into the loaded phrase mob rule, where a majority elect people and those and representing them then abuse the rights and the freedoms of a minority. And therefore, the majority itself has to be restrained, because it isn't just the people. It is individuals who are going to have different views, conceptions, policy preferences. And if a majority has unrestrained power through their representatives, then the losing segment of the population in an election can be silenced, can be taxed, can be confiscated, can be imprisoned. And therefore, even a majority must be restrained so that all people's rights are respected and enforced and recognized, even against the democratic ruling principle. So that's why, while there's a lot of ambiguities and confusions about what is a democracy, what is a republic, this was their conception that a republic, roughly speaking, was you rule through your representatives. But a republic is one that rules through representatives in a government that has been restrained, so the rights of the individual are respected, not only against the abuse of a private individual or a mob of private individuals, but against individuals who attempt to use government through majoritarian rule against individuals or minorities. That is the importance that they saw in this. And then, as you said, the amplification through the Bill of Rights. You know what? But there are certain things that are so important to us, given our experiences in general and from our recent war against the British. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, restrictions on protecting people in their person and their papers from unwarranted search, securing you against self-incrimination, rid of habeas corpus. All of these things were considered so important to secure the liberty, the freedom, the rights of the individual, that the government must be restrained explicitly on these particular ones that were fresh and in the immediacy of their mind against both an autocrat as well as a majority who can be abusive and tyrannical as the one.
Yeah, I think you're right to go back into British history on this subject, because that's really where especially civil liberties are carved out. That they don't just appear, what we know as civil liberties. Now, there's different definitions. Some people encompass freedom of speech and freedom of religion under the term. But at the very minimum, they are the rights that are enunciated in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. Due process of law, trial by jury, right to confront witnesses. And all of this goes back, as you point out, to rights that are carved out in resistance to the tyranny of people's own government, their own king. That the king was acting in a tyrannical manner. The citizenry says, stop, you're not going to do this. And that's where these rights start getting carved out. And it goes all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215. The king is saying, I wield the power to arrest any of you, to put you in the Tower of London, to torture you, to seize your lands. I can do this through my troops and you don't have any right of resistance at all because you belong to me, you are subjects. And all of a sudden, with Magna Carta, the great barons of England said, enough is enough. No, your powers over us are limited. You will not take our lives, you will not take our liberty, you will not take our property in violation of what they call the law of the land. And that phrase, law of the land, in the year 1215, gradually over the centuries evolves into the term due process of law, a phrase that finds its way into the Fifth Amendment and later into the 14th Amendment. And so when people are bringing into existence or proposing to bring into existence the federal government, you're right, they have all of these abuses in history. Now, the argument could be made, as you point out, but this is a democratic government. This isn't an unelected monarch. Well, Americans at that time feared democracy as much as they did any other form of government. I mean, notice in the Constitution, there is no mention of the word democracy. In fact, the Bill of Rights expressly protects us from democracy. What it's essentially saying is Congress cannot enact a law that takes away freedom of speech. We don't care if it's 95%. We don't care if it's unanimous. And so when you look at the Constitution, you really have to read it in terms of, in the context of the Declaration of Independence, which had been issued back in 1776. Jefferson says, people have been endowed with certain fundamental, inherent, God-given rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. No government, as he points out, has a legitimate authority to infringe on these rights, on anybody, foreigner or anybody, because everybody's endowed with these rights. Well, so a democratic elected government doesn't have the authority to take away God-given rights that pre-exist government. And the American people said, we want to make it clear. Now, what was the primary means by which governments had historically done this, where they round people up and they take them to the Tower of London to torture them, or to the dungeon in Italy to torture them? They did it through the troops. I mean, they're not going to send some mild bureaucrat out to arrest somebody. They use overwhelming force, and the way you use overwhelming force, you send out your soldiers, the ones with the swords, and if anybody tries to resist, they're ready there to put them down. And so there was a tremendous antipathy among the founding fathers and the framers against standing armies. I mean, if you look at their quotes, the antipathy is clear, that they said that this has always been the time-honored way by which tyrants have done these kind of things. Arrest people who are dissenting, for criticizing the government, torture them. It's through massive standing military establishments. And that's why there was no big, massive standing military army. There was a small army in the early days of the Republic and through the 19th century, but nothing like exists today, and nothing that had existed throughout history. And then, of course, no CIA, no NSA to monitor and spy on people, because, as you point out, they wanted what was called a republic, a government with very few limited powers. No military establishment, giant military establishment, no NSA, no CIA, no spying network. They wanted a limited government republic. And so they bring this thing into existence, and people are leery. They don't trust government officials, even though they're the ones that are democratically elected in them. They felt that just because a guy's democratically elected doesn't make him some kind of saint. In fact, it's very possible that people democratically elect a guy who's much worse than a guy who just takes over in a coup, or a king who's unelected. And so that was the whole idea behind the Bill of Rights, and really the Constitution is, okay, we're going to have a democratically elected government, but there's going to be limitations on the powers of these people, where they cannot do bad things to people in terms of taking away freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and rounding them up, indefinite detention, violating due process of law, violating trial by jury, and so forth. So, as Mises pointed out, Richard, the only real advantage of a democratic system is it enables people to peacefully change their government, change directions. Otherwise, the only way to do that is through violent revolution, which is obviously very costly. But it certainly doesn't guarantee freedom, and in fact can be a direct threat to freedom through the power of the majority to oppress the minority.
Yes, one of the biggest problems that we have faced, especially beginning in the 20th century to the present, is the ambiguity and the confusion between freedom and democracy. They've often been used synonymously, and historically there are reasons for that. When it was the oppression of the monarch, the one and his entourage of the noblemen who had their manors in the countryside, it seemed that the idea of one way to restrain the king was slowly to expand the recognition that the people who are ruled should have a say in the laws, including the taxing of them for various governmental purposes. So, and since once the people had a say, they would be attempting to limit the government to secure their own freedoms. It was easy to see that democracy means the establishment, the extension, the preservation of the freedom of the people. But the fact is that freedom and democracy, though easily confused, and if I can just elaborate with that, it was also reasonable in a sense when you understand it. In the 1920s and the 1930s, with the coming of the Bolsheviks and Lenin's revolution in Russia, or Mussolini in Italy, or certainly Hitler in Germany after 1933. These were regimes that abolished representative government, however weak-like or almost non-existent like in Imperial Russia, or working parliamentary systems such as in Italy or Germany in the early years of the 20s and the 30s. It would seem it was easy to say that these tyrants are abolishing free institutions. And that one example of this was the abolition of democracy through which the people express their will, their desires, their selection of those who will hold public office. And therefore, the defense of freedom appeared to be parallel to, if not synonymous with, the defense of democracy. And that's reasonable at one level. I'm for democracy if you mean it in the sense of a representative government versus Hitler, Stalin, or Mussolini. I think any advocate of liberty is. But what has happened is that just as there are subtle differences between, but they're almost used synonymously now, liberty and freedom, there's a difference between freedom and democracy that has been blurred. That if the people rule through their representatives, and presumably with no restraint, then anything that the people express through their election is a reflection and a representation and a reality of freedom of the people. And it is not so. And that is what the Founding Fathers understood clearly and with deep reflection, that even a majority must be guarded against, because they can be as tyrannical as the tyranny of the monarch who's won. And therefore, when they say Congress may pass no law, and as you said a few minutes ago, even if it was the entire population minus the one, that population may not oppress a person's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, and the other enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights. Precisely because we need to guard ourselves against the tyranny of the one, and as John Stuart Mill expresses it in his famous essay on liberty, against the tyranny of the many. Now, that is what has been lost. An example of this, and we've talked about it before, is that we invade Iraq, we try to set up a quote democratic regime there, and the globalonists who set this up, the international interventionists, well, we're giving them democracy, there'll be freedom in Iraq. And to their surprise, they start holding elections. And guess what? Who's elected to office? No women. Restrictions on civil liberties of not only women, but other Muslim sects, of which Iraq is divided among them, Sunnis and Shiites and so on, and Kurds in the north. And suddenly the majority is restricting the freedoms, oppressing the freedoms, denying the freedoms of subgroups in their own society. And the advocates of American spreading democracy are shocked. This is not what we meant, because that's exactly what the problem is. Merely because people vote doesn't tell you what the government will do. The majority may believe in individual liberty and only elect representatives who believe in laws and legislation to secure that individual freedom. Or they may elect representatives who believe in privileges, favors, and benefits for some at the expense of others through restrictions, restraints, favors, subsidies, prohibitions, etc. And therefore democracy becomes as oppressive of at least groups in that society that have nothing to do with the ideal of those who have this vision of making the world safe for democracy. And democracy has become such a how can I put it, sort of a divine word, okay, a divine word. You mustn't blaspheme against it. You must challenge it. You must question it. That to even advocate restraints on the democratic choices of the people and through their representatives implies that you don't believe in freedom because you want to restrain them. And this is a dilemma we have, because as Hayek and others said, it isn't free government that's failed. It's a particular form of free government in which securing of individual liberty has been weakened, and the majority through its representatives and the coalitions that form majorities are basically increasing at liberty to do anything they want.
Right, and I think it has to be said that no matter how well your Constitution is written, if people lose the spirit of liberty that behind it, it's gone. I mean, people say, oh, well, it really hasn't worked. Well, I look at the Constitution as sort of a seawall, that it protects against rising tides, it protects the community. But it isn't designed to protect against a tsunami. Tsunami comes in, and I think that's what happened with the welfare state, the warfare state. You had a sea change, a tsunami of public opinion in favor of socialism, imperialism, and that overwhelmed the Constitution and the philosophy and the spirit of the Constitution. And so what we really need to do is to reignite that love of liberty and that love of a republic, of a constitutionally limited government republic, and the idea of free markets and economic liberty and all the other aspects of liberty, trial by jury, that guided the framers and our founding fathers, and that's the way we get back our free way of life. Richard, we're about out of time, though, so we need to wrap it up, and enjoyed the conversation, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Absolutely. Until next time, representative government with constitutional limits to secure the freedom of each of us as individuals.
Yeah, and come and visit our website at fff.org. And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you all next week.